Shalom. So everybody's heard the one about this Jew who walks into the synagogue. He walks into a shul, and they're reading from the Torah, and he wants to be called up first. He demands to be called up first, because when they're reading the Torah, so the first aliyah, the first one who comes up to make the blessing over the Torah is the Kohen, because the Kohen, the descendants of Aharon, are always honored first. So he comes into the shul, they're reading from the Torah, and he makes a big scene, and he demands that they call him up. And the Gabbai, who is the one who calls the people up, he tries to reason with him, because the man's becoming hysterical. And he's saying, listen, it doesn't work like that. You have to understand. I can't just call you up as a Kohen. That's ridiculous. You can't just walk into here and demand to be called to the Torah as a Kohen. The man is very insistent. He gets all agitated, and finally he blurts out. He says, listen, my father was a Kohen, his father was a Kohen, and I want you to call me up as a Kohen. And it's an old joke, but it's still very funny, because the fact that the man's father was a Kohen and that he comes from a long line of Kohanim meant that he was also a Kohen. But I guess that he didn't know that. Now the Kohanim, the descendants of Aharon, the priests who are serving in the Mishkan, the sanctuary, the tabernacle, and the Mikdash, which becomes the sanctuary, they actually are like a chosen people within the chosen people, and they have great responsibilities towards God and their community, and actually to the whole world. And as it states later on in our Parsha, this week's Torah portion, Parashat Korach, it's an eternal salt-like covenant before Hashem for you and your offspring with you. Now, in this week's Torah portion, Korach, just when you were thinking, after last week's debacle of Parashat Shalach, which was such a game changer, you were probably thinking that we've hit bottom. And where could we go from here? Lower than we already are at. Now we have the situation, the decree has been made. This generation, this woeful, quixotic, enigmatic, contradictory generation, with all its greatness and all its foibles, will now have to live with itself. All these people have to live with each other until the generation dies out in the desert. It was a congregational slip-up. The whole congregation really was not acting correctly in unison, and now must pay the price. This in itself is a connection to this week's Torah portion of Korach. As our sages say, Avera goreret Avera. One sin leads to another. Now we also have an issue of the functioning of the congregation. And we learn of the controversy of Korach and his tragic end and all of those who were with him. And of course that's no joke. It's no laughing matter. But like the man in our anecdote, Korach wanted to be a Kohen, but he wasn't born one. Korach actually was a brilliant and accomplished individual in his own right. He had important Levitical responsibilities towards the operation of the Mishkan, but he wasn't satisfied with that. He wanted to be a Kohen as well. And he was consumed with a tremendous jealousy that was fueled by his own arrogance. And that is the secret, in a nutshell, of Korach. It was all about him. Everything, his whole worldview, everything was all about him. And he was so consumed with himself and his place and his significance and his role and his importance that ultimately he winded up believing only in himself. He actually made it very clear that in the end his gripe was not with Moshe and Aharon, but actually with God himself. Ultimately he ended up denying the divinity of the Torah. He denied Shabbat. Indeed, he got to the point where he became so important that he actually denied God himself. On a mystical level, there's an idea in this week's Torah portion that the holy Arizal explains that a spirit of Cain, entered into Korach. You remember Cain from the beginning of the Torah, from Bereshit. He was the first and the head of all murderers. And Cain, the name Cain, is from the expression kinyan, and a kinyan it's a type of ownership, acquisition. And of course, ownership and acquisition is about gaining, it's about achievement, it's about possession. And when his mother named him, she saw something about him, and she said that she called him Cain because she says, I acquired a man with God. So Cain's essence was acquisition. In his own mind, in his own eyes, he was the very embodiment of kinyan itself. He was about himself, about possessing, about being, and nothing else, which of course is the opposite of the midah, of the attribute of inclusiveness. What is inclusiveness? It would be that if you see someone, you would want that other person to grow, to prosper, because you yourself feel in your life that something is missing from me, and that something can only be completed by the other. And this idea of inclusiveness is a worldview. It's the opposite of the worldview of Cain. And this inclusiveness is in everything. It can be within one person to make a unity of heart and mind. It certainly is the goal of dealing with separate people, to bring them together, to make them into one unit, into one tzibur, one congregation. Also the upper and the lower worlds. This is the whole job of Israel in the world, is to bring about this unity. But the midah, the attribute of a murderer, is to separate, to rend everything asunder. And actually, this cosmic controversy between Korach and Aharon, this is what this parsha is all about. It's really about their midot. Aharon was chosen by God because of his characteristics, his midot. And those attributes, they were passed on to his descendants. These are the attributes that Hashem loved. And Aharon is the polar opposite of Korach. And it's not for naught that the Holy Arizal, in his Kabbalistic understanding, brings in this idea of the relationship, the spiritual connection between Korach and Cain. Where is that coming from? Where is this idea all of a sudden of some sort of spirit of Cain entering into Korach? Actually, we're dealing here with prototypes. We're dealing here with archetypes, and even with, we could say, with personality templates. Cain, in his own eyes, was the only game in town, and all there is. But everything about Aharon that we know about, it's all summed up right here in chapter 16 and verse 11, when Moshe said, what is he that you protest against him? What is he? Because in his own eyes, he was nothing. So if Cain's essence is killing, which is the epitome of acquisition, because it eliminates all the competition, Aharon's essence is making peace between people, bringing together. Inclusiveness. This is the famous statement of the great Hillel in the first chapter of Pirkei Avot. It sums it all up. He says, be from the students of Aharon, loving peace, pursuing peace, loving all creation, and bringing them to Torah. And Aharon was such a polar opposite of Korach. Korach was the only game in town. It was all about him. He had to be on top. He liked attention. But Aharon was very low in his own eyes. In fact, our sages tell us, when it came to Parashat Korach and the instructions that Moshe gave over to Aharon in Hashem's name to light the menorah, our sages tell us the background that Aharon felt a little bit crestfallen that he hadn't been included with a major task in the inauguration ceremony of the tabernacle. And then he was given the job of lighting the menorah, and our sages tell us that Moshe said to him, Lama ata bosh, lakach ata nivcharta, which means, why are you embarrassed? For this you were chosen, which actually means, why are you embarrassed? This is why you were chosen, because of these feelings that you have, these feelings of inadequacy, because that shows that you are so centered on serving Hashem and not on serving yourself. And the further clarification, which checked the death that came about because of this nuclear attitude of Korach that was so infective and that so adversely affected the children of Israel. The death that started to run through the camp was clarified and ultimately checked through the Ketoret, the offering of incense. Why? Because our sages teach us that the Ketoret, the incense, is the secret of inclusiveness. It's a famous teaching that in the Holy Temple, the Ketoret, the incense offering, is the most beloved of all the temple service because it represents this elusive concept of the value of every individual, of inclusiveness. There are 11 ingredients, and one of them, called chelbana, is very foul-smelling. But when all of these ingredients are together, it makes the most wondrous and beautiful aroma because it represents this unity of all people. The Ketoret is never brought by an individual. It's only brought as a community. But Korach acted as if he cared about every single one. In the very beginning of the Torah portion, he said to Moshe, "Why do you exalt yourselves above the whole children of Israel?" He acted as if he really believed that everyone is holy and that Hashem is in their midst, but actually he cared only about himself. And in the ultimate showdown between Aharon and Korach, because this is really what this is all about for us today, it's also a showdown about their midot. But it's the ultimate showdown between Korach, who was filled with this selfish, self-centered, and self-aggrandizing Kayin spirit, and Aharon. And in the ultimate gunfight scene, the one who had said, "This town ain't big enough for both of us," he actually had already left town. And the weapon was not a weapon at all. It wasn't a six-shooter, but it was an instrument of understanding and further ultimate clarification. It was a dried-up staff of wood, because Moshe actually took one branch and fashioned it into 12 equal portions. Each one was exactly the same, so that no one could say, "Oh, his was a little fresher, his was a little more moist." There's a scientific explanation. They were cut from the same piece, but it was Aaron's that blossomed. Because Aaron's covenant, and the covenant with all of his children, based on his midot, is evergreen, ever fresh. It was Aaron's staff that blossomed because his midot, his attributes of self-nullification and of putting everyone else in the center and of serving everyone else, these are the attributes which are the polar opposite of Korach. Famous story about Aaron, that his overwhelming character trait was, as Hillel taught in Pirkei Avot, loving peace and pursuing peace. And he was so consumed with inclusiveness, with bringing people together, the opposite of Kain, the opposite of Korach. And he would see friends that were quarreling, or a couple that was quarreling. He would, through a certain, you might say, holy subterfuge, he would actually reconcile them by going over to each one separately and saying, she was fighting with you, but she feels so terrible, and she says it's all her fault. And then he would go to the husband. Then he would go to her, and he would say, he was quarreling with you, but he feels so terrible, he says it's all his fault. And then a couple would meet each other, and they would embrace, and they would be so happy, all because he brought about this state of rectification. And I call it holy subterfuge, but really it became true. Everything that he said became true because his view became the reality for that couple, because he knew how to bring the best out in everyone. This was the secret of Aaron. And this is why the almond blossoms on his staff, they blossomed, they came forward, they came out, because he knew how to bring out the blossom in every person. and had to see the best in everyone, unlike Korach, who was concerned only for himself and who looked at people only to analyze and quickly decide how they could best be of service to him. Aaron bequeathed this characteristic of self-nullification, of loving all people, of seeking to bring all people together, of inclusiveness. He bequeathed this characteristic to his descendants, and that is why he was chosen by Hashem in an eternal salt-like covenant for all of his descendants forever, to serve Hashem a special service. And this is why they are the priests. And this is the biggest lesson that Korach could not get. True service of God is all about serving other people.